Hello. Hi. I'm Sheldon. Okay. So, this testimony of mine has been brewing for a good couple of years, as you'll hear when I get to the point. So, lately, for the last couple of months and maybe the last year, God has really started to shift my perspective of my testimony. And God has been trying to take the self out of me, and He's been using my testimony, which I've known for a very long time, obviously, because it's my testimony. And He's really started to reset it and reprocess it. And I kind of want to take you guys on that journey of where God started shifting things around, and only realizing it after reassessing my testimony. So the crux of my testimony is based on what my mother went through. In 2012, my mother passed away of cancer. And so my journey of selflessness to some extent had changed, and hearing God's perspective and seeing God's plan for my life actually started then. I just didn't see it. So just a background on the kind of steps my mother went through before we started discovering that she had cancer. So in the early stages, my mother was struggling with stomach pains and so on. So she got booked into the hospital, which was close to us, False Bay Hospital. And she went for a checkup, and they sent her home for piles. Gave her medication for piles and sent her home. And in my mind, this was literally the point where if they'd spent more time and put more effort in, they would have found out where it was going to get to. So they sent her home, and then a few weeks later, she started fainting because of the stomach pains she had. And when she had gone back to the hospital, they found out that she had ulcers from her stomach all the way up to the back of her throat. And so I'm not medical in any way. I don't even know how that all happens. But in my mind, these were just steps that had happened. So they obviously gave her treatment for these ulcers. And a couple of weeks again, it was just another time period. And she went for another checkup, and all the ulcers were gone, but they'd found a spot of cancer on her colon. I'll hold this thing. Okay, so they found a spot of cancer on her colon. So they started giving her radiation treatment for this colon cancer. It led to it spreading so much that they had to remove her colon, and she had to get a colostomy bag. And I don't know if anybody knows what one of those are. It's a bag that sits outside and replaces your colon. So your waste and stuff goes into it, and you replace it, and you put a new bag in, and so on. So this point was actually quite a pivotal point, showing what my mother's personality was like. I got my lively, bubbly personality from her. During this time, this thing. So during this time, this thing would make farting noises. So there was like a bit of flesh. It was a weird-looking thing. It was weird, but it would make farting noises every time it passed wind, I guess. And my mother would laugh, and she'd be like, "Guys, come listen, come listen, come listen." And she'd call us to her room just to show us the noise the thing was making, and it was a bit random. So my mother, special woman. So they then went for another checkup and to check how the bag was going and if things were going right. And they'd actually found that there was cancer in both her liver and lungs. And not sure how that all happens, how it jumps from, I'm not even sure. Anyway, so they'd found the cancer. It's a little bit of cancer in both her liver and lungs. And started giving her radiation treatment for the cancer firstly. And it wasn't killing the cancer, so they gave her chemo. I don't know if anybody knows the process, but then they started giving her chemo, but the chemo started making her lose a lot of weight. So it got to like a tipping point where if they'd given her too much chemo, it would weaken her so much that it was kind of just contradicting the point of the whole. So it got to a point where the doctors had said to us, listen, your mother's cancer is so bad that the chemo is not going to help, and if we give her too much chemo, it's going to kill her, which was quite strange for me to hear. So they gave us that time limit, and they said, listen, your mother only has this amount of time to live. And so this is when God started doing the shift in perspective that God's really started to reveal now. He started showing me how selfish I actually am when it came to visiting my mother in hospital and in hospice. So they'd moved my mother to a hospice because she was, they couldn't treat her anymore and wasn't really getting anywhere. So they moved her to a hospice, so the first shift of perspective was a very selfish nature in me that I discovered was when my mother was sick and had cancer, she didn't look like my mother. She was skinny. She had lost so much weight. She actually weighed the same weight of a 10-year-old, to like 36 kilos, which is like Ethan's weight, it's scary seeing that, and I didn't want to see my mother. It was a memory I didn't want. So, let me just go down. Okay. Yeah, so, I have a friend of mine, during this time my mother was sick, I didn't want to see my mother, like I said, but this friend of mine, Ashley, who's now my best friend because she's earned it, fought with me to take me to go and see my mother. We didn't have transport, and she would actually say, Sheldon, we need to go see your mother, and I was like, I don't want to, it's not a memory I want. And she's like, you need to go see your mother needs to see you. And she would buy little juices for my mother and little snacks and stuff like that, and it would just totally go over our heads that we were so worried about our selfish, my misery and the things I'm going through that I didn't even care about that kind of stuff. So that was the first shift in perspective. That was, my mother actually had to see me. She needed to see us as her kids, my brother and my sister and myself. And I didn't even pay attention to that at all. And that was the first realization that there was a selfish bit of nature that I had to get rid of. And so that was a good change where I visited my mother and seeing the joy that it brought us visiting her. Other shift in perspective was during this time, I played Jesus in an Easter play. So this was while my mother was sick, and so God gave me the opportunity to play Jesus, and I'd watched Passion of the Christ as the scene from after he got whipped to the Via Dolorosa scene. So on his way up to the crucifixion, him carrying his cross. So I'd watched that scene so many times just to try and get into character. And that was another shift in perspective, knowing that what Jesus Christ had done for me and the kind of suffering he had to go through in order to redeem me and save me from my sins. And that was another boost. I needed a lot of those little boosts of motivation and life and so on. This was one of those moments. So God was doing these constant little shifts of perspective. Another one was my biological dad, who had left my family when we were very young, had come to see my mother to come and set things straight. He needed to, he was just looking for some forgiveness from my mother. And during this time, my mother was very delirious. She couldn't understand what was going on because she was on chemo. She didn't know what was where and who was when and whatever. So my dad came to visit her at the hospice, and us seeing my dad was that's a testimony for another time, was a very eye-opening moment. He had come and asked my mother for forgiveness, but my mother had not remembered so my biological dad and my mother split up because of an abusive relationship. So when my mother had seen him, she started panicking and started shouting, get away from me, go away from me, kind of thing. And my dad started crying. We all started crying. It was a mess. It was a pot of tears. It got to the point where he said, Penny, please forgive me. I'm very sorry for what I've done. Penny is my mother's name. Please forgive me for what I've done. I'm really, really sorry. And that was seeing the role shift between my stepdad and my biological dad was another shift in perspective of redemption and what God can actually do in people's lives. And luckily it came at this point, because any other time would have been missed. And he got the forgiveness he needed. He just needs to be, brought to the Lord, I guess. The biggest shift in perspective was when God started, where I feel God really started talking to me, and where I started hearing God's voice for the first time, and started being obedience on this walk to obedience. Was on the day my mother had passed away. Okay, this can be a bit tough. I'll try my hardest not to. Guys, forgive me. So on this day, we had the doctor had phoned my aunt and my brother and so on. So all the people who were directly linked and so on. So we went to go visit my mother at the hospice, and so we were hanging out by my mother's bedside. She was still in the main ward with a whole lot of other people, and my sister started singing worship songs for her, which is what my sister does. My sister, she sings very well. She hasn't pursued that in a while, which is a pity. So she started singing worship songs for my mother, and my mother was smiling and so on. And a couple of minutes went by, and my mother started shaking and started choking and just panicking. Something was going on. So the doctors moved her to a private ward, a little room. It was very, very small. It was probably the size of the kitchen, and we could barely all fit in there together. And I started fighting with God again. And obviously, the whole time I was fighting with God. I mean, it was a very difficult time, the whole process, till when she got diagnosed with cancer. And I was fighting with God. I was like, Lord, what the flip is going on here? I'm really wanting you to communicate with me. I'm wanting you to say something. What must I do? What is going on here? You can't be doing this to me. And it was selfish. It was a selfish mentality. But I needed answers. And I said, God, your will be done. And that's a very difficult thing to pray. Your will be done, because God's will is never, a lot of the case, not what we want. And God has a better view obviously for our lives. So I was like, God, what do you want? What must I say? What do you want me to do? And God said, I want you to go to your mother and tell her she can go. It's all right. We'll be okay. You can go, Mommy. So I did this. I tried to sneak into the room without anybody seeing me, to go to my mother's ear and whisper it to her, because I didn't really want to. Woo! Sorry, guys. Okay. So I got the opportunity to go to my mother and say, Mommy, it's okay. You can go. We love you. And it's all right. And that's, obviously, as I said it, I didn't believe it. I was like, no, I'm just saying it because God said I must say it. I don't want it to happen. Obviously not. I wanted my mother. I wasn't ready for my life to fall apart. So I said, Mommy, you can go. And my sister, who's 7 years younger than me, did not see what I had seen and wasn't hearing what I was hearing from God, and pulled me aside, pushed me up against the wall. She's very strong, very strong. Pushed me up against the wall, hit me on the chest. Why would you say that, Sheldon? Why would you say that? You shouldn't, hitting me, crying, shouting at me. 5 minutes later, my mother starts shaking again. Doctors pull us out the room and close the doors and try and see what's going on. It then led to my mother passing away. Finding out that my mother, in my mind, that's what my mother needed to hear. My mother needed to hear that we were going to be okay and she could go. So that whole time she was struggling to stay alive just for us. And she was fighting to be there for us. And in our minds we needed it, but she needed to go. And so that was a shift in perspective, a big shift in perspective for me. I went through a very dark period after that. Obviously, I was fighting with God. It's like, God, you gave me this responsibility to say this thing. I wasn't ready. What were you doing? Started to blame God for the things I wasn't ready to do. And God's obviously slowly but surely revealing things to me every day as I walk through, as I go through my walk, obviously. God's revealing these places where I need to be obedient in order for Him to proceed with His plan in my life. And yes, we could have totally skipped the whole thing if God just changed me to the man He wanted me to be without having to go through something. But it kind of loses the value of God doing something. If I just become the man by God clicking His fingers, there's no value in there besides the fact that God did it. In my mind, God had to take me through things in order to teach me a whole lot of lessons. And it's unfortunate that obviously God used my mother's death in order to teach me this. But, so I'm going to read some Bible verses, which is something I should have done a little sooner. Start getting Christian. Okay. So God obviously gave me Bible verses during these times, and I didn't want to hear them. Nothing made sense to me. Nothing was right. I was just like, God, this isn't. So God was trying to shift me to God's perspective, and He needed to reveal what His perspective was for my life and what He thinks. And the first verse is from Isaiah 55, verse 8. God speaks, He says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." That to me, at the time, was a very God's thoughts are not my thoughts, I will never understand, which is the truth, but I saw it as a very negative thing. And in my mind now, that is the most reassuring thing in the world, knowing that His thoughts are way above mine, so I'm always going to be thinking irrationally and thinking now, I'm going through this now. And somebody told me this very interesting thing that about where your mind is during a time of suffering. If a kid falls on the ground, they scrape their leg, they're thinking about the current problem, which is the sore on their leg and what's going on. And a dad's thinking, don't worry, we'll put a plaster on and it'll heal. But the kid's thinking, no, it's hurting. It's hurting. I didn't care about the plaster. He didn't care about what's happening, that it's going to heal in this and this time. He's thinking about the fact that it hurts now. And that's just to show that God does know things above what we know, and He's out of what we know. He knows more. And it's just plain and simple. It doesn't need explanation. You can't explain something that's unexplainable. It's just as simple as that. Plain and simple. So then God started preparing me for, we need to start shifting what we see to what God sees. And how do we do that? In my mind, I was not seeking God. I wasn't putting God first in my life. I wasn't making space for Him. And I was selfish. I couldn't even see that my mother needed to see us. I was too worried about myself being hurt by my mother's, the state she was in, and it was horrible. Now it seems like the most inconsiderate thing to even think about. It was incredibly selfish of me. So how do we get ourselves to a place where we put God in priority? Because we obviously need to seek Him. And in Matthew 6, verse 33 says, Seek ye first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given unto you as well. So I'm constantly thinking, God, I'm wanting to have your plan for my life. I'm wanting to have your plan, but how do I make space for God? And God does these things in order to make space in your life. He started revealing things. I'm only now going through the process of actually practically pursuing that part of my life, it's been since 2012, 5 years. And it's a slow process, but God's doing stuff. It's great. It's great. The other Bible verse He gave me was, this was actually given to me by the person who gave me lifts, Ashley. It's Jeremiah 29, verse 11. He says, For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope for the future. Now is the future. When that was given to me, I didn't believe where I'd be today, and wouldn't believe what God has done. And I wouldn't. If you had shown me Sheldon now to the Sheldon then, I'd be like, And God's done a lot. God even talks about, earlier in Jeremiah, about the potter and the clay. What God does with clay, us, is He shapes us, and He needs to take things that aren't of Him off, like a diamond. Diamonds look horrible when they come out of the rock. They don't look like much until they've been cut. Then they start looking pretty. And that's what God needs to do, is God needs to cut out the things that are in your life that are not Him. And there were things in my life that were not Him. So I would say, just as I end, this is going to be my end. Hopefully I did, yes, made the time. Is that you pray that God constantly shifts your perspective, that God constantly gives you His plan for your life, and that when you're going through stuff, especially through the darkest times, obviously I can't say I did that during the darkest time because I didn't give a damn what anybody had thought. It was a slow process. If you're going through some tough times, try your hardest to pray that God gives you the plan He has for your life. And you need to be open to that. You need to be open. It's the hardest thing during those dark times, man. It's tough to even think rationally during those times. But it's just praying that God gives you the perspective that He has and His plan for your life and reveals that to you. I just want to close with a quick folk tale. It's a short thing I heard from Ravi Zachariah. This guy's a flippin' genius. There's this folk tale about a man and his horse. This is just to show you what perspective does to situations and how you shift your mind. So this farmer saves up so much money to buy a horse because he wants a horse. So he buys this horse and he puts it into his little cage. I don't know what you call it for horses, but the den thing. That's it, stable. Cage. The stable. Okay, all right. So he gets this horse, and he's so happy. And he wakes up the next morning and he finds that his horse has escaped his cage. And so the horse had run away, and the man's neighbor says to him, how unlucky, your horse has escaped. Man, you spent so much money saving up for this horse, and now it's gone. And he's like, oh, man, what a pity. Anyway, so the next day comes by, and the farmer wakes up again and sees that his horse had gone and come back with a whole lot of other horses. And that's a great thing, because now he's got more than one horse. It's amazing. So the neighbor pipes in again. Mr. Know-it-all says, oh, wow, look how lucky you are this time. Your horse ran away, but now he came back with other horses. What are the chances? Jeez. Anyway, so the very next day, the farmer sends his son out to start cleaning and grooming the horse and brushing the horses and so on. And one of the stray horses that the other horse had brought back, kicks his son and ends up breaking his leg bone, snaps it. Then Mr. Know-it-all says again, look how unlucky you are. Your son's leg is just broken. Look at those horses that you so valued and now broken your son's leg. And laughing. Then the next day, it's very, very short 4 days of things happening. The next day, okay. So the next day, a militia group comes, and they're busy recruiting young men for their horrible army of murdering people and stuff. And they wanting to recruit his son, but obviously his son had just had his leg broken. So Mr. Smarty Pants then pipes in again and says, hey, look how lucky you are. Luckily your son's leg was broken by that horse that yeah. So just the shifts in perspective of each situation from that guy's point of view is that either way, the perspective we have on each situation is always going to be based on that situation. You're always going to think this is a lucky moment, that's an unlucky moment, this is like. But if we seek God's outside perspective, which God was like, I'm needing to stop that guy from joining the militia group because that's going to wreck his life. Let me make this guy buy a horse. So there are processes God uses in order to shape where you're going. And it's just, we need to pray and seek, God, what is that perspective? What are you doing in my life now in order to get me to where you need me to be in order to minister? And I feel God has used my mother's death and that whole situation in order to put me in a place where I can share my testimony, which is the greatest thing. I think it's the most amazing thing. And like I said earlier, if anything, pray for obedience and pray that you can hear God's voice in those times of suffering. Might drop. Okay, I'm done.